One of the most famous examples is on the side of the Emerson building here, Psalm 8. Psalm 8 says, "O Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth." And it ends with that same statement. And it begins with a statement of wonder of how grand and majestic and huge the universe is. "When I consider the works of your hands, the stars of the heavens, this is amazing." And then I remember us. What are we that you would even consider us, O Lord? What is the Son of Man that you even care for us? That placed against a cosmic backdrop, human beings empirically look really insignificant in the universe. And many modern people agree that we are. Yet Psalm 8's point is to say, by drawing this contrast, that against what a surface impression would give you, the greatness of the universe actually calls out the significance of human beings. That of everything God could have chosen to place his image upon, it's us. And the contrast brings out how unlikely that is, how radical that is, and how stupendous that blessing is. And when Malik backs up to the creation of the universe, I think he's forcing you to make a decision. When you know someone, when you hear a story about human beings and radical suffering happens to them, your initial reaction is to have empathy, to think about how horrific this is, how much it ought not to happen. And when Malik backs up, he's forcing you to say, if you think the universe is this big and it has no meaning in it, what is one more dead sun? What is one more dead sun? It doesn't mean anything. Or you can understand that in spite of the radical contrast between the hugeness of the universe and its history, that the point of everything else is the experiences of people like the O'Briens and the tragedies and the redemptive possibilities of their suffering. The reason I bring this up is to say the Bible both begins and ends by using the same narrative device to talk about sex. Both Genesis 1 and 2, the first two chapters in the Bible, and Revelation 21 and 22, the last two chapters in the Bible, give us a cosmic scene of universes coming together, of stars being put into heaven, of Revelation 21 and 22, the universe being recreated, and this unbelievable universal cosmic backdrop. And yet, they increasingly narrow their scope until the final scene in both Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelation 21 and 22 is a wedding. Genesis 1 and 2 ends with God escorting the woman to the man as kind of the first father at a wedding and saying the two are going to become one flesh. It's a way of saying you would never think this if you were just looking empirically at the world, but sex, marriage, is what the world is about. It's the point of everything else. And then Revelation 21 and 22 reminds us of that, but takes it a step even further and reminds us it's about sex and it's about marriage, but in an even deeper sense than you think, because the wedding that happens at the end of the Bible is not between two human beings, but between the Son of God and his people. The bride and the bridegroom, the lamb and the bride come together, and the last scene of the Bible of human history is God marries his people. And of course, there's no pagan overtones there if there's actually a physical act of sex going on, anything like that, but it's saying from the beginning, you've been hearing that sex is what it's all about. And in one sense, yes, it is. But what we're also reminded of at the end is sex is what it's all about, not because of anything in sex, because of what sex points to. And throughout the Bible, especially the New Testament, you're constantly hearing these echoes, these refrains. Paul says in Ephesians 5, a man shall leave his father and his mother, cling to his wife, and become one flesh. And then he exclaims, this is a profound mystery. But then he immediately backsteps and says, but I'm not talking about human marriage. I'm talking about Christ and the church. And the clear thrust of what Paul says there is, I feel like if you do see the symbolic dimension of sex as a Christian or in the Christian story, you're often tempted to still hear it wrongly and to kind of hear it like this. God created sex and marriage and they were just kind of their own thing. And then somewhere farther on down the line, God was like, that's a pretty good analogy for the way I relate to my people. I'm going to talk about my relationship with my people, like it's sex and marriage. Paul says it's actually the opposite. From the beginning, it was sex and marriage that were symbols, and the relationship between God and his people that was the reality. Let me end with two stories. One from the New Testament of Jesus, and one from a famous Christian named Augustine. In the Gospels, Jesus, at one point in his life, is confronted by a group called the Sadducees. Sadducees, all you got to know about them in terms of this story is they don't believe that there will be a resurrection from the dead in the future. They are Jews, but they believe that when death comes, human existence is over. And to test Jesus and to kind of trap him in what they perceive to be the stupidity of believing in an afterlife, they point Jesus to something. Jesus, look at this lady. She's been married to 7 different men in her life. When she's raised from the dead, which one is she going to be married to? Answer us, Jesus. That doesn't make any sense. See, resurrection can't be real. And Jesus responds by saying, you do not understand 2 things. You don't understand the Scriptures, and you don't understand the power of God. You don't understand the Scriptures because if you would have been listening, you would have been hearing that sex is always pointing beyond itself. It's whispering about something else greater than it points to. And so to say that sex is not going to be there in the afterlife, in the world to come, is just to say that when the reality comes, you don't hold on to the shadow anymore. When the thing that is signified arrives, you don't hold on to the sign anymore. And then he also says, and you don't understand the power of God either. Most human beings, I think throughout history, not just in our culture, find it, kind of a priori, totally implausible and even unimaginable that if there is life in another world after this life, that if it doesn't include sex, then it's got to be worse than this one. And what Jesus says is, if you think that, you do not reckon with the power of God. Because sex has always pointed beyond itself to the one who made us and who made us sexual beings, and the one who, in terms of both intimacy, relationship, and ecstasy, joy and fulfillment, sex can't hold a candle to that. And so, last story, many of you know about Augustine. Augustine is maybe the most important Christian thinker that the church has ever seen rise up in its ranks. And many of you have probably either read or heard of Confessions. And if you've read Confessions, his autobiography, very closely, you know that Augustine, for not only his childhood and his kind of adolescence, but even for until he was about 30, was obsessed with sex. I often think when I read Confessions that if Augustine lived in our day, he'd be labeled a sex addict by psychologists. He was obsessed with sex. And even after he became intellectually convinced that Christianity was true, he refused to get baptized because he could not get over the guilt of his ongoing sexual failure. He was constantly pursuing sex as the fulfillment of his desires. And throughout Confessions, as Augustine looks back on his earlier life, he not only sees failure sexually in his life, but he also sees that redemptively, surprisingly, there's a story of grace that was underneath his story of failure all along. And he says, by his failures of constantly looking to sex as that which is ultimate, as that which would fulfill him, and constantly having those expectations shattered and disappointed, Augustine learned another story, which is that all along, if you have ears to hear, sex is constantly crying out, this is not it. This is not what you were made for. This points to something else. And so Augustine, in the book, very famously said, and I think this applies no more in human experience than it does to sex, our hearts are restless, unbearably restless, until they find their rest in you, O Lord. So thanks for coming. We're going to do some Q&A here in a minute, but I appreciate you guys coming out tonight.